We're just about ready to start our first painting, but before we begin, I'd like to mention a few things about how I'd like you to save your artwork files. I like to use what's called iterative saving. Iterative saving means that you'll be able to save multiple copies of your artwork as you make progress, so that if you need to, you can go back to an older save to recover from a mistake. It's also a great way to experiment without having to commit to a change. Now, what I mean by iterative saving is I don't want you to use the iterative save command in Painter. I just want you to manually save iterations as needed. And so in my example here, you can see I have week 1-1, week 1-2, week 1-3, and so on. And then I have some other files. This is my completed file here with my name on it so that we know who did it. And then I have a couple extra copies. One is for the web in case I want to do something with it on the web. And then there's one that's for printing. And we'll go ahead and open this week 1, and I'll just kind of show you what I mean by iterative saving. So here's a point where I wanted to, and we'll be doing this in our lesson coming up here. I wanted to merge the sky and the clouds layers together so that I could blend them. And this is a good point to save because I might decide that after I've already dropped all these layers, maybe I, for some reason, I'm not happy with the results I get later, so I want to go back to this version before the layers are dropped, and of course I can. If I open a copy that's a little bit further down the line, we'll see that I've made some progress here, and the clouds and the sky are merged together. And I was happy with those results, so I went ahead and worked a little more on it, and then I saved another copy. And in this copy, I plan on merging all the layers again, so I made sure to save a copy. And then if we go to week 1-3, then you can see all the layers are flattened. I've put a signature down here in the bottom right-hand corner, and I went ahead and saved another copy just to have a copy that's completely flattened with the signature on it, so I can have one with and one without, because there might be some times where I don't want my signature right there on the front. I feel like it could be kind of distracting sometimes. Or maybe I might want to move it if I'm going to do a print, and for some reason the print has to crop off a little bit. I can always take my signature and I can just move it up out of the way, or move it to the other side, or do anything I want. So this is kind of shows you the point of having all these different files, is it gives you a way to really get the most out of your painting, and you won't have to really worry so much about making any mistakes or messing anything up if you have all these extra files. And then later, if you decide that you're done with this painting and you don't want these files anymore, you can just go ahead and just delete the extra ones that you don't need. Make sure you have your workspace set up like I have mine here. You'll need access to all of these different palettes and tools while we're working. If you need help getting your workspace set up this way, check out the resources folder for more information. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to load our sample image into our reference image palette. So you'll do that with this little open reference image button, and you'll select the week 1 image, and then you'll have a good idea of what we're going to be trying to achieve here. And the next thing that we'll do is we will choose a canvas size and create a canvas. So we'll go to New from the File menu, and we have some options here. If you're unfamiliar with resolution and image dimensions, you can check out my resource video on that. We're going to use these settings here. We'll set the resolution first to 300, because that's a good resolution for printing. And then we'll set the measurement to inches, and then we'll do it 10 inches wide by 8 inches tall. And just make sure that your paper color and paper texture just set to their default there. And if you want to, you can name it. Let's use a good naming system here. I'm going to call it Aaron Rutten Week 1-1, because we're going to be doing iterative saving. So this will be the first of this, and we'll go to OK. And then I'm just going to make sure that it's full screen by double clicking there on the window. And then we'll just go ahead and save it. So I'm going to do a save as, and you want to make a folder for all of your artwork. And then within that folder, go ahead and make a folder for each week. So this will be week 1. So inside of that week 1 folder, I'm just going to go ahead and save this. And it's up to you if you want to save it as a RIF or a PSD, but you want to use either one of these formats. Don't use any of the other formats or you might lose your layers. If you're uncertain, just use RIF. I find that occasionally there can be some issues when you start to get a lot of layers going. Things can get kind of buggy and Photoshop works a little bit better, but there are some incompatibilities with the Photoshop format and with some of Painter's features. So you'll have to check out my resource videos for more information on that. But I'm going to go ahead and choose PSD for this particular project. And I'm going to click Save. And there you go. So we've got this 8x10 canvas now, and we can print this on an 8x10 piece of paper and it'll look really nice. And the goal is going to be that at the end of this class, when we have this painting completed, you're going to have a print version of this and you're going to have a web version. And then that way you'll be able to do pretty much anything you want with this painting. Okay, so let's start doing some actual painting here. First thing we'll do is we'll start with the sky. So we'll create a new layer and let's call it sky. And we'll want to define a horizon because that'll be really helpful to know how to paint our sky. So let's also create a horizon layer. And on the horizon layer, we'll use our rectangular selection tool and we're going to draw a horizon. Now the trick with this is you want to start tapping and dragging outside of your canvas on this gray area. And if you need to, you can hit tab to make your palettes go away, or you can hold space on your keyboard. I'll be doing that a lot. So I'm going to hit tab and then I'm going to tap out here and I'm going to drag and I'm going to end out here on the gray area outside of the canvas. That way I get the whole canvas and I don't just get part of it. Now, we're going to want to use the rule of thirds here, and if you don't know what that is, you can check out the resources, but we'll just want to make sure that we don't do things right dead center. I'm going to go slightly below center, maybe a little bit lower than that, like right here. That looks like a decent place for the composition, and we'll just go ahead and fill that with whatever color. Let's just use this dark green. Something kind of generally representative of the grass that we're going to want later. Whoops. Let me get the hens and chicks. Okay, so this is good to point out because I've switched to my workspace, and on my computer, anytime I switch my workspace, for some reason it switches my paint bucket, and you might be having this problem too. So what you need to do is you need to set your fill to current color. And we'll just do an undo, and then when I use the paint bucket, I'm going to get what I wanted. And I'm going to do a Control D to deselect that selection, and now we've got a nice horizon layer. And we can go ahead and we can go back to the sky layer, and still using the paint bucket, we'll pick a nice sky color. Now, you can kind of look at what I have here, and I recommend that when we're picking colors, don't just sample from what I have here. Let's try to pick the color by eye, because I think that's going to be more helpful for you. I just kind of pick colors, and if you watched the week 1 warm-up, I kind of explained my process for picking colors. So I'm going to just try to pick that color of the sky by eye. So I'm going to go right around here for my hue, and then I'm going to decide how dark or how light do I want it. I know I want it to be pretty light, and then I know I want it to be pretty saturated, so I'm going to go right about here. And try that and see if I like it, and I think that I do. So now we're going to detail our sky a little bit using the digital airbrush. And this airbrush works really well for making gradients. You kind of let the brush make the gradient for you. And the trick to this is you want your brush to be very large. And large is kind of relative to what you're painting. So the sky is pretty big, so I want my brush to be pretty big in relation to the sky. Because when I paint with this brush, the bigger it is, the better the results I'm going to get if I'm going for a gradient. So I'm going to shift my color a little bit darker in value, and I'm going to shift the hue a little bit more towards indigo. And then I'm going to hit tab to make my palettes go away, and then I'm going to paint a gradient that's darker on the top and gets lighter as it goes towards the bottom, using kind of medium pressure, and then lighter pressure to kind of taper it off. Go back over the top a couple times just to kind of get a nice smooth gradient. You don't want it to be lumpy. You want it to be nice and smooth, and you don't want it to jump back and forth between light and dark. It has to start dark at the top and end light smoothly. And we'll hold down Alt on our keyboard and sample our original sky color here. And let's go up along this top edge of the color picker to lighten our color, and we'll shift it a little bit in the hue. Actually, let's shift it a lot. Let's shift it towards yellow here and do kind of a light cream color like this. And we'll paint right along the horizon line. Light pressure to do another gradient. This will kind of make the sky look like it has some atmosphere. You can really do whatever colors you want as much as you want. But we're going to go for a daylight sky here, so try to keep it kind of like what I have here. And then this particular brush has a habit of leaving some kind of little digital speckles, which don't always look so good, and you might not be able to see them on my screen, but maybe you can on yours. So to smooth those out, we're going to use this diffuse blur blender, and you'll want to have the settings that I have here, and we'll go ahead and blend using circular strokes. You don't really have to go over the whole sky. You want to stay away from the edges if you can help it, because you might pull in some of your some white from the background. It's going to be a bit of a quirk that we're going to have to deal with. There's not really much of an easy way to fix it, so try not to blend right on your edge or from the outside of your canvas in. Just avoid the edge, and if you need to use a small brush to get in there and do it, you can, but you don't really have to blend this too much, just enough so there aren't going to be any of those little speckles from the brush, and then everything's nice and smooth. The next thing that we'll do, now that we have our sky, is we'll make a layer for clouds. So we'll create a new layer, call it clouds, and we'll start with a screen composite method, and we'll use a kind of a warm color like this, a warm cream orange, something like this, because I want these clouds to look a little warmer and have a little bit of color contrast on the sky. And for this, we will use the jitter airbrush, which is right here. And you want to make sure that you have these settings that I have listed here. And when you paint, you should be getting something like this, using pretty firm pressure too. I'm just holding and dragging, and I'm doing kind of circular strokes. Now, we're going to want these clouds to be in perspective, so we're not really going to worry too much about really drawing a perspective point or using the perspective guides or anything. We're just going to kind of do it by eye at this point. What you want to know ahead of time is that our perspective point in this piece is going to be central, so it's going to be right along here. We're going to be looking kind of straight ahead. So your clouds that are kind of off to the side, we'll want to angle them a little bit. Their bottom edges should be just a little bit angled. I'm just going to kind of exaggerate. Clouds that are straight on can be kind of straight on, and then the clouds that are over here should be kind of angled inward. That'll really help to give everything some perspective, because if you just do them all straight across, they're just not going to look that good. And try to make just really random shapes. We're going to blend them a little bit later. Just use your imagination here. Don't try to copy my reference image. Don't try to copy what I'm doing here. I'm not even going to copy it. I'm not even really looking at it actually while I'm doing this. So I recommend that you do the same, because the goal here isn't to copy anything other than your own observations that you made of what clouds look like in real life. You don't want them to be too filled in. You want them to have all these little lumps and gaps. That gives the clouds character. It saves you from having to paint all that extra detail. The clouds that are in the foreground, which is up here, should be bigger and broader. And when we start moving into the background towards the horizon, we need to start to use perspective. So we want our clouds to get smaller in scale, like so. We also want them to start getting a little more squashed, stretched. When you get near the horizon, you can really start to go kind of more level. You don't have to really do the angular thing so much. That's really more important for these foreground clouds. I think I got something like that I like. Give this a little bit more here. And then we'll just zoom out just to get a feel for how the whole thing looks. And I think that looks pretty good. So now we'll blend the clouds a little bit, and we'll use the coarse oily blender. Now, this brush is going to react differently depending on a lot of different factors. Your grain setting, your opacity, the size of your brush, the paper texture that you've chosen, and then the paper scale and the paper contrast. So you'll really probably have to just play around with these until you get the result you want. You'll also want to look in your advanced brush controls here, because there's also one more setting called static bristle, and you can play around with this thickness and clumpiness and get some different results there. Let's switch our paper to basic paper, and let's use these settings that I have here and set your brush to what I have here, and let's check out the results we get. This brush now really kind of smudges and pulls more. If we turn the opacity down very low, we get a slightly different result. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to turn the grain and the opacity down pretty low to where we get something like this. See how it's kind of just fluffing the cloud a little bit. It's not really stretching it too much and making it too jagged or too weird. You really got to play with these settings and fine tune them on your end. But you should be getting something kind of like this, where you can kind of push and pull and kind of stir up the clouds. Make some nice cloud shapes. If you pull the sky color in, you can kind of use it to your advantage to make different edges and imply shadows and things. You want to have the top edge of the cloud have the most character, and then just kind of leave the bottom edge alone. Don't really worry about it too much. I'm going to hit tab and make my palettes go away. And just have fun with these shapes. Try to make them as unique as you can and as random as you can. You can kind of go for whatever style you want. If you want a kind of stormy, windswept style, you can do that. If you want them to be a little more clumpy, like cumulus clouds, you can do that too. These are going to kind of be the wispier kind. And the background clouds, don't worry about them too much, because they should have a little less detail and character since they're so far away. You're not really going to be able to focus on them as much. And in this particular piece, we're not really going to worry about overlapping clouds. If you want, you can go ahead and give that a try. But with this screen layer, if you end up using multiple layers, they don't really blend very well. So this tends to work better when you just have clouds that are kind of they each have their own space. They're not overlapping. So we'll play around with these settings a little bit more. Let's turn our opacity up, and let's zoom into these clouds a little bit closer. And we'll use a smaller brush. We'll just kind of refine the edges a little bit more, give it some more character. I'm using these kind of winding clockwise strokes. And then we'll zoom back out and see if we like what we got here. It's good to back off and look at your piece, see how it looks, and I think that's looking kind of the way I want. Now, we want to add a little bit of shadows to our clouds here. You don't have to. You can certainly stick with what you have here, but in this particular piece, I think we want to add a little bit of shadows. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the select layer content trick by right-clicking on the clouds layer. We're going to go to select layer content. That'll put a selection around the clouds. We'll create a new layer. The selection moves to that new layer, and we'll make that layer a multiply composite method. We'll call it clouds shadow. And let's do a Control-Shift-H to hide our selection. And then we'll choose the digital airbrush. And the color that we're going to want for our cloud shadows is going to be the color from the sky or the color from the ground, or a little bit of both, whatever would be reflecting back onto the underside of the clouds. So let's just sample our sky color up here because we're not sure what our ground color is going to be exactly yet. And let's just shift it in hue a little bit towards teal here. And let's also desaturate it a little bit and make it a little bit darker. So maybe we get kind of a green gray like that. Let's paint and let's see. I think that's a good color. So you want to just put your shadows along the bottom edge of your clouds. You're probably going to have more on your foreground clouds than you will on your background clouds. Don't mind this little fringe thing that you're getting. This is also another one of these quirks that we're going to have to just deal with and manage later. We'll get rid of all that, blend it away, and won't be there anymore. So just pretend it's not there for now. So there we go. Our clouds have a little bit of character. And if you want to blend some of that shadow color, you can using the coarse oily blender. Same way that you made the cloud shapes there. Kind of push away or pull in some of this shadow color. That looks good. And then you can play with the opacity as well to kind of make it a little more subtle. Something like that will work. Now at this point, we're going to do an iterative save. So let's go to File, Save As, and let's save it as -2. And go to Save. And don't worry about this. This is going to pop up anytime you have a selection active. Our selection's still active. As you can see, if we do Control-Shift-H here, our selection comes back. And I can hide it again. So we don't need our selection active anymore. So let's just do a Control-D to deselect. We can do Select None from the Select menu. And we did an iterative save because we're going to merge our cloud shadows, our clouds, and our sky layer together. So hold Shift after you've clicked on the cloud shadow layer and then click on sky to get all three of these layers selected. And then you can do a Control-E, or you can do collapse layers from this little menu here. And now our layers are merged. Let's go ahead and rename it. So let's call it Clouds plus Sky. So now we have at least some indicator of these layers now having been fused together. And we'll use the diffuse blur brush to go ahead and blend them a little bit. I'll just zoom in so you can see what I'm doing better. What we want to do is we want to get rid of any of this white fringe that happened when we added the shadows. So you'll see there's kind of a light edge along the bottom of all these clouds. We don't want that there. We want that to go away. So use pretty firm pressure with this brush to just blend it away. Doesn't take much. It helps to kind of blend the bottom of the clouds anyways to make them blend into the sky a little bit better. Get something like that. And then what you want to do is you want to use a bigger brush, something about this size, and you want to use really light pressure now with the same brush to just kind of blend these clouds a little bit. You kind of just go in different directions and just kind of lightly blend them, just barely touch them a little bit. Just kind of softens them, makes them look more distant. And at this point, if you feel like you want to do anything else to the sky, if you want to blend it more with one of these blenders, you can certainly do that. And then go through and blend it again a little bit more. You kind of want to really play around with these different settings on this brush because you can get all kinds of different clouds. The more character your clouds have, the better they're going to look. What I like to do is I like to hunt for boring areas in my clouds. Like if there's just too much white in some area, I'll pull in a little bit of the sky color and then just kind of make it a little more interesting. Give it some more visual interest. Look for some more boring spots. There's a couple boring spots over here on this one, so I'll just fix this a little bit by giving it some character. They look more real that way. And then if you want to, probably should because you don't want them to be so sharp, use that diffuse blur brush again and just lightly blur up some of that. You can also use these distortion brushes, the Distorto and Hurricane and Turbulence. Those will give you some pretty cool effects. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. You could see here, really get some cool results. You got to watch out when you go into your sky here. Not to mess with it too much, but you can get some really cool fractal shapes there. So I think that will work for our clouds. Now let's start adding some detail to the grass. Let's change the name of the horizon layer to Field, and let's turn on Preserve Transparency. And let's pick a color that we're going to use for our base color. So looking at what I have here, the greens are very important because if you don't pick the right green and you don't use the right combination of greens, your grass isn't going to look like grass. So typically what I do is I have the shadow or the darker part of the grass over here in this more blue-green area. And then the highlights are typically more in this yellow-green. And my grass is generally kind of bearing more towards this side, which makes it look more like this particular type of grass. But there's lots of different kinds of grass that are different colors, and you can experiment with that. But the important thing is to get it right. So we're going to go with a color, maybe something like this, and we'll use the paint bucket. Go ahead and fill it. I think I like that color for a base color. And then we're going to shade it similar to how we did the sky. We want the background to be lighter and we want the foreground to be darker. So we'll pick a darker green color, something like this, and shift the hue towards blue. We'll use the airbrush, a big airbrush, like we did for the sky, and we'll have a gradient that gets lighter as we move into the background. Something like that. Sample our base color here for our grass. And let's make it brighter. Shift the hue towards yellow a little bit. And we'll paint the top side of this gradient. Now, what we want to do here to really make this grass look realistic is we have to establish a perspective, because we can't just do it straight across. It won't look right. So I'm pretty good at imagining these perspectives in my mind, but I'm sure that there's other people out there who haven't done it quite as much who can benefit from this real quick. And since there's the perspective guides feature in Painter, we'll go ahead and just put that to use for this example. So let's click on this perspective guides tool to turn it on. And if it doesn't automatically show up, click the on button here to enable it. And then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to start with a preset. So we'll click on the preset button and we'll go to 1-point standard horizon. And you'll want to hover over the center here. If this is hard to see for you, you can turn these opacity settings up. I'll go ahead and do that so that we can see this a little bit better. Now you can really see that. What we want to do is we want to drag this red line so it meets up with our horizon. As close as you can get it, right on it, if you can. And so this is going to be our vanishing point, our perspective point. So we're going to want to put in some highlights and some shadows that kind of follow these lines. You don't have to follow them exactly, and you don't have to follow every line, but you want everything to kind of radiate out from this point. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll turn off perspective guided strokes. Make sure this is off. So otherwise your brush strokes are going to get locked, which isn't what we want for this case. And we'll use the airbrush with kind of a smaller size, and we'll just paint some strokes that kind of emanate out from this point. Just do some undos. If you don't get them right, do an undo and try again, because they need to be pretty spot on. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off this perspective grid. I'm going to click back on the tool and I'm going to turn it off because it's just kind of hard to see with it there the way I had it. Now you can see I have some nice radiating lines there that go off towards perspective, and then I'll just use a bigger brush to kind of enhance that a little bit, fill it in a little more, still following those same angles. We can waver a little bit because the ground's going to be lumpy. Get something like that. And then if you want, you can sample some of your darker color here, one of these greens, like this for instance, and you can paint back in some shadows following those same angles. Kind of makes it look like there's waves kind of going on here, and that's how it would be with grass. You don't want a natural field to look like it's a lawn that's been mowed where everything is all perfectly level. This grass is going to have varying length, and the wind is going to cause the grass to kind of separate, as would the contour of the land. So now that we have that there, let's go ahead and blend it a little bit with a diffuse blur brush, and kind of scrubbing back and forth side to side here horizontally to kind of blend some of this up. You don't want to blend it up too much because you don't want all your detail to go away. But you want to make this look not so harsh. Stay away from your edges of your horizon and the edges of your canvas when you're blending, because again, you can accidentally bring in some white color from outside of your canvas. Using pretty firm pressure and these winding circular strokes. Really want to blend this up. If you want, you can also use the coarse oily blender. Get some different results with that. You might have to play with your opacity setting to get it to work. It gives it a little bit of grain, which could be good. And then I'll blend it a little bit more with the diffuse blur. So all we're trying to do is just get kind of a basic grass kind of texture here. Give it some character. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to add a little bit of contour and depth to the land. So we'll go back to the airbrush and we'll lighten our highlight color a little bit just by sampling our lightest color here, and we'll make it a little bit brighter. And a couple spots just here and there. Just kind of put a couple little places where the land sticks up a little bit more. And we'll make a darker kind of more blue-green, and we'll have a couple places where the land kind of sinks in. Just kind of putting some different little spots here. Something like that. Adding dark kind of pushes the land down, and adding light kind of pulls it up. Now let's add some tinting and texture to the grass. So we will make a new layer, and let's call it grass tint. Make sure preserve transparency is turned off. Let's set the composite method to multiply. Go back to the field layer and we'll right click on it, or use the right click button on your pen and go to select layer content. Now we have a selection. We'll go up to the grass tint layer and our selection goes with us. And let's do Control-Shift-H on our keyboard to hide the selection while keeping it active. We'll go ahead and grab the sponge, and we can go ahead and use this dark green color here. Now we want to make sure that our texture that we're going to use to kind of make these grass blades. I want to make sure our texture stays in perspective. So in the foreground, we want our brush to be bigger and our texture to be bigger. And as we move into the background, we want our brush to get smaller so that our texture gets smaller. So we'll start with the foreground here. We use a big brush. And we'll paint in, we'll make our brush smaller. Go across again, smaller. At a certain point, once you get into the background, you don't have to really go too small with it. Make it something like that. Now, if you find occasionally this might happen, even if you have your selection active, somehow it might just be a bug in Painter. You can paint outside of it. And if that happens, just get your eraser and try to erase it, and then it doesn't erase. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to do Control D to deselect, then you'll be able to erase it. Next, we'll blend this a little bit to give an effect of creating a lot of little grass blades without having to draw them all individually. And so to do that, we'll want to make sure our selection is deselected by doing Control D or select none. And then we'll go ahead and blend a little bit. We'll use the diffuse blur blender, and near the horizon, we'll blend lightly, because if we blend too hard, it would kind of erase our texture. We don't want to do that. We'll blend lightly, horizontally, straight across, right near the horizon. Don't go down any further than that, though. Now, beyond that point, we'll do little short vertical strokes. You can angle them a little bit if you want, but try to keep them pretty vertical. Otherwise, your grass will look like it's getting blown by the wind. I'm just doing short little strokes. Pretty light pressure still. And see what this is doing is this is really giving the impression that there's a lot of grass blades sticking out. There's many ways to paint grass. This is just one, but it works really well for getting a big field of grass really quickly. We'll add a little more detail to it to really make it stand out. I started going down rather than up because I want to make sure that I don't paint outside my canvas. We get something like that, we're looking good. Now we can play with the opacity of this layer and reduce it until we get a more subtle blend. I think we want something like that for this piece. And then let's add another layer. Let's call it Grass Tint 2. This will be another layer of tinting that we'll put on this layer. So we'll get our selection back for the field by selecting it and then right-clicking on it and going to Select Layer Content. Do a Control-Shift-H on your keyboard to hide the selection. And let's put in some different colors for dead grass and dirt and different things. We'll pick like a kind of tan orange color like this. We'll go to the Grass Tint layer, Grass Tint 2 layer, set it to a multiply composite method. And then the brush that we'll use for our tinting, let's use the square chalk. And in the paper textures, you could try different paper textures. I'm going to go ahead and use this Polypay wool that's down in the organismal textures. And let's turn paper scale and the paper contrast up. Let's see what we get. If we're getting some kind of really random broken up shapes, then we're looking good. Because if you try to paint this stuff in too intentionally, it doesn't always look right. So if you just kind of have a couple little spots scattered here and there, it's going to make it look better. Try different colors, throw in some yellows and some brighter oranges. I don't want to go too crazy with this, but just enough to give it some character here and there. We're going to blend all this in a minute. Let's take the coarse oily blender and blend with it a little bit. Let's take a look at what we have for our settings here. I'm going to kind of blend it in a couple places, not everywhere, just to kind of break it up so it's not so sharp. Something like that. And let's use the diffuse blur to blend it some more. I want this stuff to kind of just fade in. Then we'll take down the opacity until it's just kind of subtle. Isn't something that really needs to stand out. You just want to have a couple different little points of interest in here that could be dead grass or different kinds of plants. Who knows what it is? It doesn't really need to stand out. It'll just kind of be there as background material. Now let's add some details to the grass. So we'll create a new layer. Let's call it grass blades. We're going to draw a few individual grass blades. So we'll zoom in a little bit so we can see our canvas closer. And we'll use the Detail Oils brush with a very fine tip. And we'll sample our lighter grass color here. And we'll lighten it just a little bit more than that. Let's see what we get here. If you're getting a very thin, very small blade of grass like this, then you're looking good. I'm using kind of varied pressure. I'm kind of starting out with firm pressure and then I'm tapering it off. So what we're going to want is we're going to want smaller, shorter grass blades in the background because we're trying to maintain our perspective here. In the foreground, we're going to want bigger grass blades. So let's start in the foreground. Grass kind of grows in clumps, and we want to kind of just here and there, really wherever you want, throw in some of these grass blades because it's really going to help to make the background grass texture kind of blend in, puts everything in context. Then you really know how long the grass is and just gives you some more points of interest. You can do this as much as you want, wherever you want. I'm not going to spend forever doing it in this example. You can look at my finished piece where I spent more time on it to get a feel for how much I want you to do. I'm kind of concentrating these lighter grass blades mostly in areas that are already kind of light, but you can also do them in the dark areas too. They'll really stand out. And if you want, you can do some dark grass blades. I'll just sample one of these dark green colors, something like this. You can put in some dark grass blades. Now, I wouldn't do that many of these because grass is going to be mostly light in this particular piece. It doesn't hurt to throw it in here and there. This could also be little twigs. If you wanted to put a little tree thing out here, you could do that. Have some little thing growing. The more of this you do, the better it's going to look. I think that's okay for now. You can continue adding more later if you want. Now let's add in a light source, which in this painting will be the sun. Let's zoom out so we can see our sky a little bit better. And let's make a new layer above the clouds and sky layer, and let's call it sun. Now, the easiest way to make a sun is to use the glow brush. That's right here. And the best way to use the glow brush is with a screen layer, or a screen composite method. So we'll set our composite method to screen, and then we want to think about what color we want for our halo or corona around the sun. I want that to be kind of a pale gold. So I'm going to pick a kind of desaturated brown. If you're unsure of how to use this brush, it kind of has a very specific way of working. So you'll have to watch one of my reference videos to get a feel for that. But for now, just kind of pick this color here and we'll go with that. And we'll use a pretty big brush, kind of like we do with the airbrush. And we can have our sun coming from anywhere. Let's go ahead and just keep it on the right side for this piece. And the diameter of your brush is going to determine the radius of your halo. So try to make it about that size, maybe a little bit bigger, and just do a tight little circle. Actually, we have to to deselect our selection. It's good to forget this sometimes because it reminds you that it's happened. If your selection's still active, you're not able to paint anywhere else other than in the selection, even if you're on a new layer, which is usually what you want. But in this case, I don't want that to happen. So I need to do a Control-D to deselect my selection. Now I can paint wherever I want. So I'm going to do a tight little circle here to put in a sun. Make my brush a little bit smaller, and I'm going to do another little tight circle. And if I want to add some more corona to it, I can pick a dark red-orange like this and use a really big brush and kind of wiggle around, and if I get something I like, I'll stick with it. You could also pull some little rays off of it if you want to. I think in this case, I'll just leave it like it is. And if you want to move it around with the layer adjuster, you can try out some different positions. I think maybe I'll put it kind of like it up here in this piece, maybe kind of touching that cloud almost. So now that we have our primary light source here, we need to adjust a few things to kind of really make it look like this area of the painting is brighter, especially the grass. So what we'll do first is let's go to the clouds sky layer and let's turn on preserve transparency. Let's get a kind of deep indigo color like this. Digital airbrush. Pretty good sized brush, and let's just darken sky a little bit over here in the corner. And maybe a tiny, tiny bit in the right corner. That kind of helps to make the sky look like the light source is kind of dominating this area over here on the right. And then let's go to the field layer, still with preserve transparency turned on. And let's sample our lightest field color there. Let's lighten it a little bit more, shift it a little bit towards yellow. And now anywhere that's a place that you want to make a highlight, we'll go ahead and just paint in some brighter areas here. It doesn't have to be everywhere, but you kind of want the right side of the painting to be a little bit brighter overall. And we can darken the left side a little bit. Let's use one kind of blue-green, dark blue-green color. Let's just darken it just a little bit. Now we're kind of drawing focus over to one side. Something like that works pretty well. And then let's put a few things in the background, maybe some hills or some kind of visual interest, so there's not just this epic distant horizon here. So let's go to the cloud sky layer, add a new layer. We'll call it horizon details. Now, this could be anything. This could be distant trees, houses, mountains, hills, anything you want. Let's go ahead and put in some mountains first. So let's just use the digital airbrush. Let's sample this indigo color up here in the sky. It's kind of medium dark blue. Let's just shift it, make it a little more gray. Maybe shift it towards cyan just a little bit and get a color that is kind of like this. I think that works pretty well. Make sure preserve transparency is not turned on. And I'm kind of scrubbing back and forth horizontally here. Just kind of scrub in something that looks kind of like distant hills or a mountain range or something. You want it to just kind of be really soft. Something like that will work. And then we'll turn on preserve transparency. And let's take a brown color like this. And on the side that's underneath the sun, just kind of tint it slightly brown. That'll give it a little bit of character. And then let's use a light kind of cream white color to just kind of paint right along the edge very lightly to kind of separate this from the foreground. And then we'll play with the opacity just to kind of set it back. So we want this to be really distant and really subtle, nothing that stands out too much. And let's make one more layer. I'm going to make some distant houses in this because I feel like that gives it some interest. Turn off preserve transparency. You can take whichever colors you want. I'm going to use a scratch board tool and I'm just going to put some little dots of things out here. Who knows what this is? This could be houses. Could be trees. Who knows? Some little sticks that stand up. I'll zoom in here so you can really see what I'm doing. It's just going to be subtle stuff. We'll use a little bit of white on part of it. Something like that. Throw in a little spot of red maybe. That stuff's just barely going to show up there, and I think it gives it helps it really achieve that there's distance there. And maybe this is a farm or something and you're out in the country. Puts it in context, and that's always good. Now the last thing that we'll do is we'll add a layer for a vignette, and I think a vignette's a nice finishing touch for just kind of bringing the piece together. We're going to make it a multiply composite method, and we'll use a deep blue like this, pretty good sized airbrush, and you'll want to vignette on the side that doesn't have your sun, because we don't want to try to put dark on top of light. It's going to obscure our sun, and it's not going to look right. So we're kind of drawing the focus into the center of the piece now by doing this. And you can do this as much as you want and make it more or less dramatic. I'm going to kind of go there, and then we can back it down a little bit so that it doesn't stick out so much. And we got something like that. So now at this point, we're going to save a copy again in Iterative Save. So we're going to go to Save As, go -3, and then we're going to, this is going to kind of be the, more or less the point of no return. We're going to flatten all our layers down to one layer. So we'll go to Layers and Drop All. And we're doing this because we're going to want to blend some things together. When you try to blend layers that are separate, you end up with this white fringe that I don't like, and it's hard to get rid of, and it kind of ruins everything. So if you flatten everything down to one layer, once you're done working on the layers, you can go ahead and blend it without having to worry about that problem. So I like to use the blur brush. That really helps a lot to set things back. I want to make sure that you don't have anything selected by doing a Control-D, and go ahead and start painting. You'll see that as you paint along this horizon, if you kind of scrub back and forth horizontally, blur it up, houses get blurred. You can also use the diffuse blur, but try not to really stir it up too much because it'll ruin the effect of the distance. You probably don't want to use it on the houses. And you may want to blur your grass here in the foreground a little bit, just so it's not so sharp. Using the blur blender. Little background tree we made, we'll blur that pretty good. And if you see anything else that you want to blend in your sky or anywhere else, now's the time to do it. And if you decide, maybe you want to change something, if you want to add something in at the last minute, you can still keep adding layers. And if I decide I need a little bit more detail in my grass, I go through and I can add some more grass blades, and it's not really a big deal. And I can just go ahead and do another layers drop all when I'm done. When you think you're pretty much finished with this piece and you're not going to want to do anything else to it, you'll want to save it again. So we'll do a Save As. Let's say this is 4. So this will be our our final version. It's hard to say if anything's final because you can always come back to it and you never know if you will, but this will be our latest final version, number 4. And let's put a signature on it. So we'll make a new layer, call it signature. And we'll use the scratchboard tool for this. You want a pretty small diameter brush. And you can really just use whatever color you want. You can sample a color from your sky maybe if you want to. And I just like to do my initials because I don't usually really sign things, but I know some people like to. I find it's kind of distracting. But sometimes I do sign it. And you can move it around, of course, if you want. If you want to try out different locations, usually just do it down in the corner for my signature. And if I'm unhappy with the color, I'll turn on Preserve Transparency and maybe sample a different color like this green, or maybe a green that blends in a little bit better. And then the signature's there, but it doesn't really have to stand out. So we'll go ahead and just save again so that we update that last little change there. And then now if you decide you want to print this without your signature, or maybe you need to move your signature up because you're going to crop this or something and make a smaller print, you can do that. You can just turn it off and save another copy. Now what we're going to do is we're going to save a few different versions for printing and for putting on the web. So these will be in addition to our master, which is this. We're going to have a few different copies. So the first thing we'll want to do is we'll want to go to Layers, Drop All. We'll go to File, Save As, and this will be our print version. So let's save it as a TIFF because TIFF works really well for printing. What's important is that you don't try to save a TIFF with layers because it just doesn't always work out very well. And let's just call this, we'll erase the number there and we'll just call it print so that we know that this is the print version. And we can leave these 2 settings checked here and we'll go to Save. So now this will be the version that we print from. If you wanted to order a print online, you just upload this. If for some reason your printer requires you to have a JPEG, you can also save as a JPEG if you need to. Now for posting to the web, we don't want to put a 300 dpi image on the web because it's just going to end up unnecessarily large, and most people are just going to want to see a smaller version of this. So we need to downsize it a little bit. So we're going to go to Canvas and Resize. You want to uncheck Constrain File Size. Change your resolution first to 72 because that's the resolution for the web. And then we need to change the dimensions to inches. We'll change the height to 8 and the width to 10. So 10, 8, 72 is what we want. And again, make sure this box is unchecked, otherwise this isn't going to work the same way. We'll go to OK. Shrinks our image down. Now it's a good size for the web. We'll go to File, Save As again. And this time we'll choose PNG, so that's a better format than JPEG for the web. And let's call this Web. So now we know what this is. If you have to use JPEG, go ahead and do that, but PNG will work better.